cows were becoming emaciated and very, very sick. A lot of them couldn't even stand on their own and were being hoisted up with straps. Dairy producers began adding things like chalk or plaster, like what they use in casts and construction, and molasses in an attempt to make it look how milk is supposed to look. During this time, infant mortality rates increased significantly in these bigger cities. There was upwards of 8,000 infant deaths during this time. In the 1850s, New York City's milk supply was killing thousands of children, but was the milk really to blame? Hi, my name is Heather. I'm a stay-at-home mom and I do anti-scam, anti-MLM content here on YouTube. And today I want to cover the topic of the Swill Milk Scandal. The Swill Milk Scandal is often cited as proof that raw milk is dangerous. But these people who were dying and getting sick weren't even drinking raw milk, let alone milk in general. What was actually killing these children and making all of these adults sick wasn't milk at all. It was industrial fraud. Today I'm going to go over what the Swill Milk Scandal was, why it was so deadly, how it was exposed, and how it still shapes the false narrative around raw milk in today's society. In the early 1800s, the demand for milk was skyrocketing because new mothers wanted to feed their infants cow's milk rather than their own breast milk. The reason for this is a problem in and of itself. Mothers who wanted to nurse their own babies were looked down upon during this era because it was deemed uncivilized. After all, how could they possibly be hosting and taking care of their wifely household duties with a baby attached to them 24/7? People have been drinking cow's milk since the beginning of time. There were already dairies established selling milk to local cities and local towns, but there weren't any of these dairies close to the main part of the city. So new dairies started popping up right smack down in the middle of New York City and other major cities like Boston and Philadelphia. They weren't on fields of green grass. There weren't any nice pastures for the cows to roam on. They were in a concrete prison, for lack of better words. Feed such as grass and grain were being hauled in via the railroad system at this time from actual farms in the surrounding farmland around New York City. And as you can imagine, this way of getting feed from the farms to the cows was very expensive and very time consuming, and it took a long time to get the feed in. The city officials began to realize this and began a search to find a cheaper and faster alternative for feeding these cows. The cost of feed and transportation and the manpower to keep this method of feeding was pretty quickly deemed unsustainable and a hit to the profit margins. They brainstormed a way to increase profits and decrease costs when it came to feeding the cows, and a solution swiftly came, very unfortunately. This solution was distillery connected dairies. Distilleries were already pretty popular in New York City, as drinking has always been a very popular pastime, and city officials figured out that they could feed their dairy cows spent grain or swill from the distilleries. So having the distillery and the dairy combined made feeding the cows very, very quick and very, very cheap. Spent grain is a result of manufacturing alcohol. Alcohol starts out by mixing the grains with hot water to allow yeast to feed and grow, kind of like a fermentation process. This mixture is then mashed and the grain is then processed and separated out from the liquid. And the liquid that is left behind is referred to as wort, which is then further used in the alcohol manufacturing process. The grain residue that is filtered out from that liquid is what they call the spent grain or the swill. And there's no real use for this after the fermentation process and they've got the wort because they don't need this grain anymore. So oftentimes it just got disposed of. This swill or spent grain is what the cows were being fed, hence the name of the scandal, Swill Milk. At a foundational level, feeding cows this spent grain isn't hugely problematic because it still does offer some nutrients. But if you think back to the time period that we're talking about, you will remember there was no refrigeration. So it was very, very hard to keep this swill or spent grain from spoiling. They could have also dried or dehydrated the swill as a means of preservation, but oftentimes this wasn't done either. It was just fed straight to the cows. So without preserving it in any sort of way, it started to spoil pretty quickly within a day or two, depending on the temperature outside. Now, I'm sure some of the cows got fresh spent grain or swill, but majority of the time, the cows were being fed spoiled swill. Now, some of you may know that this type of product is fed to cows now, and distillery connected dairies are still an operational thing today. The difference is now people are aware of how to handle and how to process this spent grain to keep it from spoiling, so the cows are not getting sick by having this as their main source of food. A combination of this spoiled swill being their main source of food, their living conditions, and the contamination of the milk that we're going to get into soon is the cause of this very deadly era of American history. Let me paint a picture of the living conditions these cows were existing in. I say existing because this really wasn't any kind of a life for any animal. What I'm about to describe is a very disgusting way to treat any kind of animal. Because these distillery connected dairies were in the middle of the city, they were not very large in comparison to the open acres of a farm. The cows were kept in very dark and overcrowded stables, and they weren't encouraged to exercise very much, if at all, because there just simply wasn't any room to do that. Oftentimes they were even chained up in the stables. The stables were also not cleaned very regularly, and if you can imagine cows being chained up in one spot their entire time while in these dairies, this is where they eliminated bodily fluids and ate. So this was a very disgusting place to live for these poor cows. On top of being fed spoiled spent grain, you can imagine the smell. As a result of those living conditions, the cows were becoming emaciated and very sick. Many of them were filled with infections and pus. A lot of them couldn't even stand on their own and were being hoisted up with straps during the milking process. The milk that the cows were producing was very thin and very watery and had like a bluish tint to it, which we now know is an indicator of infection or harmful bacteria in the milk. Dairy producers began adding things like chalk or plaster, like what they use in casts and construction, and molasses in order to try to cover up the blue tint in the milk and to thicken it up a bit in an attempt to make it look how milk is supposed to look. Because obviously people did not want to drink blue watery milk. I'm sure this doesn't need saying, but this obviously wasn't milk anymore. People were being sold poison essentially, and being told that it was safe for their babies and themselves to consume. The way this milk was being distributed also added fuel to this already potentially deadly fire. Families would bring their own buckets to city squares where there would be carts of bigger buckets of this milk, and they would get their buckets filled out of the larger containers with a ladle or maybe just pouring it in. Now, it's important to remember that these carts were in the middle of bustling cities like New York City, Philadelphia, and Boston, just for a few examples. They also were not airtight, the lids on these containers of milk. So this allowed for debris from the busy streets of New York City to find its way into the milk. Even if they were selling perfectly safe, healthy milk, this would have been a breeding ground for harmful bacteria. If you remember, I've already mentioned there was no refrigeration. So this milk was sitting outside with debris coming into it, and who knows what temperature, for hours at a time until all of the families in line were able to get the milk that they wanted. During this time, infant mortality rates increased significantly in these bigger cities. There was upwards of 8,000 infant deaths during this time, and these deaths were eventually tied back to the adulterated milk. Now, when I first learned about this, I asked myself, how did these people not notice that this milk was strange and off and just not drinkable? The answer to that was pretty simple after I started really thinking about it and did more research. People in the major cities were not used to drinking milk on a consistent basis because they were not close to any farms before the distillery connected dairies opened up in the middle of the city. Now, if you came from a smaller outside village or town, you might be more familiar with what milk was supposed to taste like. Additionally, I'm sure some people were just buying it to feed strictly to their babies and not drinking it themselves, kind of like what we do with infant formula today. After some time, people who were more familiar with what milk was supposed to look and taste like began to notice strange things about the milk that they were receiving. It was tasting off, it was looking odd, and it even gave them pretty severe health side effects. One of the individuals who fell into the category of people who knew what milk was supposed to taste like was named Frank Leslie, and he happened to be an investigative journalist. One day he went to go retrieve the milk that had been delivered on his doorstep and noticed that there was pus floating in his milk, and it was kind of blood tinged. He had already been hearing about the rumors of the swill milk and the awful living conditions for the cows in these distillery connected dairies, as well as the dying children and weird signs that the milk was just off. After it hit so close to home, he started his investigation on the quality of the living conditions for the cows and what was really going on with the city's milk supply. He sent undercover reporters and artists from his newspaper into the distillery connected dairies to see if all of the awful rumors were actually true. The reports he got back backed up the claims of dark, unsanitary, and overcrowded living conditions for these cows, as well as the cows being chained up and held up by straps during the milking process, cows with open sores still being milked, and rotting swill being fed to them. His spies even witnessed the dairy workers mixing chalk and plaster and molasses into the milk. One reporter even described the milk that he saw as white poison. Leslie quickly realized this wasn't just a case of spoiled milk. This wasn't even milk at all. It was a case of systematic industrial fraud. He published the illustrations and reportings of his spies in his newspaper to try to shed light on the horrors that were taking place in these dairies. Readers were outraged, and rightfully so, wouldn't you be? And the doctors quickly began linking the infant deaths and the violent illnesses people were experiencing back to this swill milk. And in like fashion, other newspapers also began reporting on this swill milk scandal. City government officials quickly began trying to discredit Leslie's findings because they knew they would take a pretty big hit from this in regards to their profits, as well as the danger of being shut down completely. The public outcry grew so large and undeniable that action was forced to take place, and the New York Common Council investigation was finally initiated. In 1857, Brooklyn officials finally started investigating this milk. They discovered and exposed the disgusting conditions of the distillery dairies, and they even found out that the dairy producers were actually milking cows with bovine tuberculosis. That is disgusting. Most of the dairies were either shut down completely or forced to clean up their act pretty quickly, or they would also be shut down. This looked like providing proper food for the cows, decreasing the number of cows that they kept in the dairies, giving these animals cleaner living conditions, and treating the sick cows before they continued milking them. After these severe changes were set in place, people became very, very cautious of drinking the milk at all, and the mortality rate slowly began to decrease. Now let's talk about how this scandal shapes our milk policies and procedures even to today. It wasn't a coincidence that pasteurization came about shortly after this swill milk incident. Pasteurization is when milk is taken from the dairies and heated to such a high degree that there's no chance that any of the harmful bacteria could survive. That also means that any of the gut healthy digestion aiding enzymes are also killed off during pasteurization. After these nutrients are killed off during the heating process, vitamins are added artificially back into the milk before it reaches the stores. I think this is quite unfortunate, but I will let you do with that information what you will. Because people were so freaked out, and rightfully so, about the swill milk scandal that happened in the early 1800s, pasteurization became like a blanket solution for all dairy products. Even today, most dairy products that are in our grocery stores have been through the pasteurization process. You do have some dairy products that are not ultra pasteurized, which means it is heated to an even higher degree, which are called low pasteurization dairy products, and it is better, but it's still killing off a lot of the good enzymes and nutrients that are in the milk inherently. Was pasteurization of every milk product kind of an overreaction stemming from industrial era issues? Does it provide for a cheaper and faster means of making money and producing milk in America? I say possibly to both of these, and I could make a video on this topic alone. What do you guys think about pasteurization? Besides pasteurization becoming the standard for dairy products, rules and regulations around the selling and manufacturing of raw milk were set in place, which I do agree with. I think that no food can be deemed safe or consumable if it is not handled in the proper way. My family owns a raw dairy farm, a very small raw dairy farm in Texas, where it is actually legal to drink and sell raw milk. We are permitted by the state of Texas, and our milk is tested every quarter by the state. So every quarter, a state inspector comes to our farm and we provide them with samples of our raw milk. They take it, test it, and then let us know what our results were. If our bacteria count was ever too high, we would have to shut down until we came up with a solution and had our milk retested. We had to jump through quite a few hoops to get our permit in order to sell, which none of us had an issue with because, like I said, making sure the food product that you are providing people is safe is very, very crucial. So what should the takeaways be from this time in history? Well, it's clear that industrial incentives can lead to dangerous practices when oversight is weak. Quality farming conditions are very important. Sanitation and animal welfare are essential regardless of the food product being processed and sold. And it is very important that you take your health into your own hands and do diligent research about where your food is coming from. The Swill Milk Scandal was not a story about raw milk being dangerous. It was about how industrial corruption turned milk into a very deadly poison. Leave a comment below and tell me what your thoughts are on the Swill Milk Scandal and what are your thoughts on raw milk. I really love hearing new perspectives. That is all I have for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you stayed to the end, would you please consider liking and subscribing? It really helps my tiny new channel. I also do anti-MLM content. I have an anti-MLM playlist that I can link above. I also have a few videos called the MLM Files, where I take a deeper look at various MLM companies through the lens of truth-seeking and logical thinking. I also have a playlist called MLM Disasters, where I debunk and go over strange things that these MLM representatives say on their social media accounts. If you like that sort of content, and if you like anti-scam content like this video, please consider subscribing. And remember, your time is valuable, your worth is very real, and don't you ever settle for swill milk when you deserve the real thing. See you next time.